14 million votes. That, in relative terms, is about 44% of the electorate. The Conservative Party, between 1992 and 2017, hadn't seen a vote anywhere near that level. They only were able to start assembling voter coalitions like that because of the Brexit vote in 2016. The Brexit vote, allowing the Conservative Party to be captured by the nationalist right, allowed the Conservative Party to rebuild its popular base in a moment of crisis. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing that happened is that the Labour Party returned to its established normal, if you like. Because in actual fact, in terms of the share of the vote, it got about 32.1% of the vote. That is a little bit higher than what they got in 2010 and 2015. But much, much lower, obviously, than the big vote that Corbyn assembled in 2017, which was about 40%, about 13 million votes. They were knocked back down to about 10 million votes. So it was a big sort of retreat. And I think the other thing to mention in connection with this is that there wasn't a big surge for the political centre. The Liberal vote did not soar. Rather, the Labour vote split up in various directions, some of it going to the right, some of it going to other parties of sort of centre-left nationalism, like the Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, and so on. And that's quite an important factor here. So just to set this up, what is the big picture here? What's the conjuncture? What's going on here? I would say that the process that we're seeing is one of, on the one hand, elite decomposition. The old guys who were in charge can't run things in the way that they used to. And second, of reaction, largely led by nationalism. And we have to understand that this is not principally a matter of, or directly a matter of, enough to eat, enough money, enough bread, enough resources. Those factors are ongoing. They're fermenting away in a subterranean fashion. But I think that there's an assumption on the left, perhaps a bit less prevalent now, that if you get a crisis of capitalism, such as we got in 2008 and after, that would necessarily and automatically lead to a radicalization to the left, because it would lead people to question capitalism. It would lead people to foreground their economic situation. But it's all a question of how any crisis is mediated. And almost invariably, crises of capitalism are metabolized by the state. And that's exactly what happened in this case. The state metabolized the crisis of capitalism by turning it into a crisis of public debt, a crisis of austerity, and essentially a crisis of incomes, and essentially creating a very, very unpleasant society for anybody who is not already affluent or middle class. So they passed that crisis on to the majority. And given that there was already this long-term, slow-burning crisis of democratic participation, with a lot of people abstaining from the electoral system, people not participating in party politics, and so on, what this process did was to absolutely destroy trust in politicians, trust in the political process, trust in democracy, and it created a crisis in the state per se, a crisis in the institutions. It shook up all the old hegemonic formations which have been able to organize and run things consensually to an extent. Okay, so it's, as I say, it's a question of the mediation of the crisis. That also partly explains one of the difficulties that Labour had, because in its 2019 campaign, Labour did try to direct popular social resentment against the billionaire class, learning a thing or two from Bernie Sanders. Now, that didn't really land. It didn't land here in perhaps the way it did in the United States. I don't really know how well it landed there, but it's certainly what you got on the doorstep when we were campaigning was often people would say, well, I don't know them. I don't know the billionaires. Good luck to them. They got, they've done well. That kind of thing. Now, that doesn't mean everybody feels that way, but there was enough of that sentiment to really blunt the impact of this attempt to direct resentment in that way. And you can understand why that is if you understand that what we're dealing with is a crisis of politics. And it's people don't know but billionaires, but they know politicians. They know the elected representatives. They know the newspaper columnists. They know people in this public sphere, and they don't trust them. So there's an anti-political sentiment abroad, and Labour really, by 2019, was no longer in a position of being outside the political class, as it were. They were seen in 2017, when they made their big surge, as a kind of subaltern force. Jeremy Corbyn was seen as a bit of a political outsider, and he was. The difference between 2017 and 2019 in that respect was that Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 had enjoyed such a surge that he destroyed Theresa May, the Conservative Party's majority. Their parliamentary majority was eliminated. That gave the opposition a veto over policy. And when it came to Brexit negotiations, that meant that Labour was able to obstruct what the government was trying to do. And because of the unpopularity of Brexit among, the policy of leaving the European Union among ordinary Labour voters, the majority of them anyway, Corbyn felt compelled to use that veto, because otherwise there was a risk of losing a lot of votes to the Liberal Democrats or some other pro-European formation. But that also meant that they were basically engaged in parliamentary wrangling. It meant that they were part of the political class, and the Conservative Party were very quick to come out and say, we're trying to deliver what you want. You, the people, have voted for this. We're trying to give you that, and Westminster and the political class are trying to stop us. Okay, so by 2019, there is no longer the resurgent feel that there was in 2017. There's also another problem, because if I'm to put the question of why did Labour not do as well in 2019 as it did in 2017, in a way that's already giving away that there's a problem with how we're looking at things, because in a way we on the Corbynite left approached this, if I can characterise myself in that way, approached this in a voluntaristic way. We had a faith in leaps. And there were reasons for that. In 2015, Corbyn won the Labour leadership election out of nowhere, 60% of the vote. Quite unprecedented. No one that far to the left had ever won the Labour leadership election, let alone with that big a share of the vote. 2016, he won it again after an attempt to drum him out, so he survived. He'd driven up the Labour membership to over 500,000, which may actually be an historical record, because back in the day, they used to falsify the numbers. And then in 2017, of course, there was a 9.6% swing in Labour's favour in the general election, totally unexpected. Labour had been 20 points behind, and then suddenly they had experienced this unprecedented swing in their favour. So we had all these massive breakthroughs, these leaps. We really didn't understand entirely how it had happened. We knew that there must be something at work in British politics that was working in our favour. We also knew that we had some numbers that we didn't have before, although perhaps we overestimated how active the membership of the Labour Party was. Most of the members didn't actually join in any sense. So we thought, when it comes to an election, that will give us a campaigning tool. That will give us a moment to break out of the usual situation in which the media can just vilify us. We can speak to people ourselves. But one of the problems there is you can only do that if you've done the ideological preparation. Ideology is a long game. You have to lay the groundwork in order to present people demands that they will find plausible. Problem was that quite a lot of the demands that, or the policies that we were bringing to people, like, for example, nationalising broadband internet. Great policy, absolutely wonderful policy, but it just came out of nowhere. And it got a lot of enthusiasm from young people, and it would have been a great breakthrough, actually. But it just didn't resonate. It didn't make anybody think, oh, I definitely have to vote for them, because no work had been done. Worst of all, when it came to Brexit, the policy that people really, this election had been called because Parliament had not been able to deliver a verdict on Brexit. So this was the issue of the day. Jeremy Corbyn was not able to announce his policy on Brexit until midway through the election. Everybody had been saying, well, what's he going to do? He's going to have to come up with some sort of compromise because his party is split, because he knows his electoral base is split. In the end, he decided that they would have another referendum in which he would be a neutral broker. In other words, they would have a referendum on any negotiated agreement with the European Union, and Corbyn would not take sides. Now, you could argue that might be a feasible policy, but at that stage, it was way too late to be announcing that. Labour had obviously been in a state of incoherence and disarray over the Brexit issue, and that reflects an underlying problem. And that problem is what used to be called Labour economism, the idea that ultimately all this ideological stuff, these constitutional issues, issues to do with the state, they're all peripheral, they're all marginal. The real issue is wages and the supply of gas and water. You know, they used to call it gas and water socialism. The idea that, you know, public services, things like that matter. But we don't really get bogged down in these extraneous constitutional issues. And that meant also that when you had something like Scotland, Labour had lost huge numbers of votes in Scotland in 2015. They'd made a very small recovery in 2017, but not by anywhere near enough. And the big issue in Scotland is, will Scotland be independent? Now, the reason Scottish workers want to be independent, I'm talking specifically of those who used to vote Labour, is because they're sick of being ruled by the Conservatives when they never vote for the Conservatives. So it's a class democratic issue. Labour stuck to its traditional unionist guns. You know, they said, well, we're not in favour of independence. I mean, absolutely ludicrous position to take, but because it's the Labour Party, I mean, regardless of what Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell might have wanted to say, there was no way in hell they were going to get through an independence position. And in fact, on a whole series of national issues, Brexit, Scotland, migration, free movement, Labour in practice was A, economistic, B, evasive and equivocating, and C, quite timid. So that meant that on the issues that were polarizing people to the right, they didn't have an answer. Then there was, that cost Labour a lot of votes, particularly in a number of seats. You may have heard this term, the Red Wall. Northern seats, which used to be industrial seats, where Labourism once thrived. You know, places where it used to be textile workers, mill hands, mining workers, and so on. Now, this is a little bit exaggerated, this trope. The idea that, you know, the North used to be socialist and red and Labour voting. No, the North has always been complicated, and there's always been changes. The Midlands used to be Conservative. They went Labour. Scotland used to be a conservative country right up until the 50s because of the religious issue, Catholic Protestant issue, and that changed in the 1960s. So there's nothing inevitable about this, but what we can say is that there were a string of single industry towns and constituencies. In other words, constituencies where they only had one big industry, and that was where a lot of workers were concentrated. They were unionized, labor culture developed there, and those industries were dying. And Labour-type answers to their problems were no longer plausible. And so these were, in these constituencies, disproportionately aging voters. They were detached from Labour cultures, and they were moving to the right. And, you know, Labour had a brief moment in which Corbyn recaptured that vote by promising things like renationalising the Royal Mail, things that they like, and bypassing the Brexit issue. But by 2019, they couldn't bypass that issue. So the Conservatives won a whole lot of seats that used to be Labour for a long, long time. Okay, I've got to wrap up here because I think I'm taking up a bit more time than I'm supposed to. So let me just say this. I've tried to identify the big picture issues. I haven't talked about the sabotage being carried out by the opponents of Jeremy Corbyn within the Labour Party, largely because it's not useful to us to focus on that. We have to take that for granted. We have to know that if we engage in a program whereby we try and take control of a traditionally mainstream social democratic party run by the right, that they are going to go to war with us. And they showed that. In fact, they were brutal. But we need to focus on what we got wrong and how we misunderstood the terrain and the ways in which our tactical conservatism and our misunderstanding of where the key line of antagonism was led us to hubris, led us to misplaced aggression. And I suppose I'll finish on just a couple of observations. One thing that this experience has taught us is, as you no doubt have found out, parties matter. The old anti-party prejudice that used to be pervasive on the left, and used to see it in Occupy, used to see it in the capitalist movement. Parties have actually proven to be hugely efficacious. Even problematic parties, deeply conservative bureaucratic parties like Labour, they've been deeply efficacious at leveraging huge amounts of force at critical moments. I'm not suggesting that parties are the only things that matter, or that that's the only way of organising people. We need to think about ecologies of organising in which parties are one constituent. But we have to accept that the last few years have taught us the central importance of parties. The last observation I would make is that what we in practice ended up with in terms of our basic strategic conception was a left-wing version of the old Labour idea: if we get our guys in, our government, that is the basic problem. Get our government in and everything else will be delivered, everything will be solved. We didn't really sort of set about building what Jeremy Corbyn claimed he wanted to build at the start, which was a social movement. And that's what we needed. We needed to be organising the class, organising the working class in terms of people who are tenants, paying too much for their rent or being kicked out of their houses. We needed to be organising workers in precarious workplaces. We needed to be organising public sector workers subject to precarity. And we needed to be organising people suffering from police violence and racism. We need to be organising migrants. Here's the thing. I'll finish on this. In 2006, you guys in the United States had this huge migrants movement. You had big migrant strike wave and protests and so on. And that radically changed, I think, your political culture with regard to immigration, in that it meant it was no longer respectable on the left to be anti-immigrant in the way that it had been before. In this country, unfortunately, we've never had migrants assert themselves in that way, even though there are about 4 million of them. And that has meant that the left is actually quite backward on this issue. Not necessarily anti-migrant, but timid, prevaricating in some cases. So this is a problem that we need to deal with. We can't duck the national question. That's where I finish. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Richard. That was really, really great. So we have until about 1:45, so I will facilitate a Q&A. Folks, feel free to just type your message in the chat, and I'll just list them from there. So yeah, the floor is kind of open. If anyone has any questions for Richard on topics he talked about, maybe something that he didn't talk about, you just want to learn more, the floor is open. Don't be shy.
Would we have to do this through the chat, or can we just say it?
Yeah, I mean, you could just, well, wait, we kind of got two at the same time, so let's stick with the chat. The first one in the chat is, oh, wow. What role did anti-Semitism play in smearing the campaign? That's one. And then the next question is, on the issue of the national question, why is Scotland so different?
The anti-Semitism smear campaign, I want to be very careful here, because it's quite important to recognise that the smear campaign wouldn't have worked if there wasn't something, a small kernel of truth to it. In other words, there were worrying signs from a minority of people of anti-Semitism. And I think we're living in a global situation in which anti-Semitism is on the rise. Obviously, that's largely led by the right. It is not the left that is engaging in lone wolf attacks on synagogues, for example. Nonetheless, the left isn't, and we shouldn't think the left is pure. The left has been sort of implicated in Islamophobia, anti-black racism. Why not anti-Semitism as well? There obviously were examples of this. However, having said all that, I think where we failed is that the Labour Party leadership, and here I have to fault Corbyn and John McDonnell, never fought on this issue to, first of all, to confront the politics of the problem, and second of all, to make the distinction between, the kernel of truth that's there, as compared to the slanders and the smears. All they did was they tried to deal with it as a bureaucratic issue. They just said, well, we know there are some problems there and we're trying to deal with it, and we've got an internal inquiry and we're going to be expelling all these people. But that never really addressed the fundamental issue. And one of the fundamental issues is the state of Israel. How do you criticize the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic? I've no doubt that there are ways of being both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, right? But the attempt to imply that being anti-Zionist is ipso facto anti-Semitic was never seriously challenged. That argument was never taken on, and as a result, Labour was weak in the face of that attack. And I'm afraid that drove a small minority of members bonkers. In that, of course, if you're being attacked by the press and the leadership isn't defending you, they started to think that the entirety of their problem was something called the Israel lobby, which is not a very sound concept and can slide into anti-Semitism, depending on how it's articulated. So I think the way it worked in 2019, to answer your question directly, is that it was a disruptive factor. It's not that millions of people changed how they were going to vote based on this one issue. It did play into a general portrayal of Jeremy Corbyn as either incompetent or extremist. That much is true. It also relieved the right, because the right, they're always told that they're racist, and they are. But if they can turn around and say, well, I don't like Jeremy Corbyn because he's a racist, that kind of is a bit of a social relief for them. And it's also quite nice for somebody who's quite well off and doesn't want to pay more taxes to be able to say, well, I'm not going to vote for you guys because you're anti-Semitic. So there was a bit of that. And then also, it just, whenever the issue came up, it meant that we were on the defensive. It meant that we couldn't talk about anything else. So that was one thing. God, you've got so many other questions here. I will knock through a few of them quite quickly. Why is the Scotland issue so different? Well, the Scotland issue is different because the way in which Scottish independence has come up is as a sort of, had it just been a bureaucratic issue, about a Scottish capital wanting to succeed in order to have more efficient production or whatever, or if it had just been a bourgeois intellectual issue, it wouldn't have got anywhere. It tapped into the democratic aspirations of the majority of Scottish workers who were sick of being ruled by the Conservatives. And it's not that much more complicated than that. It's different from Brexit, because the idea of Brexit was essentially to blame Brussels bureaucrats and cosmopolitan elites and migrants, importantly, for the problems that beset British society. So that was a form of right-wing populism, and it was inherently linked to an inherited empire fantasy of Britain. Britain, the global buccaneer, trading everywhere, all-powerful, etc. So there was an element of sort of chauvinism in the Brexit thing. That's why it's different. Can I elaborate on the idea of the state metabolizing crises, as opposed to the view that it mitigates crises? Metabolism implies transformation. Well, that's true. I think it does imply transformation, because it's not mitigation. It's a question of where the crisis is allocated and how. If you get a crisis that is a crisis of production, or let's say at first a crisis of finance, a crisis of the flow of money and so on, and then it becomes a crisis of production, and then in order to cope with that, you engage in a process which is essentially about adjusting class relations, right? It's essentially about shifting the balance of power in the direction of private capital, large capitalist corporations, and away from the welfare state and away from unionized workers. That doesn't, mitigate the crisis for anybody but capital, right? And even then, it didn't really solve the underlying problems of capitalism, though it was supposed to help. What it really did was that it shifted the burden of the crisis to recipients of welfare, to disabled people, to single mothers, to people who work on poverty wages and rely on state subsidy in order to survive. The majority of people on welfare in the UK are in work. I'm sure it's something similar in the UK. So this was about transferring the costs of crisis. That's what I mean by metabolizing it. And also giving it a new set of political significations, because they didn't treat it as a crisis of production. They treated it as a crisis of debt, as a crisis of, we spent too much in the past. Labour overspent when when things were going well, and now we're left to clean up the mess, and so on. I mean, that's a real transformative work that's going on there. There's a whole bunch of other questions. I don't know if I can answer all of them. How do we meaningfully invest our time in political parties, given that we know they're often conservative and yet also powerful? I think that it's a question of not putting all one's eggs in a single basket, if I may put it like that. In other words, we have to recognize what parties are good for and what they're not good for. So parties are not good for spontaneity. Parties are not good for grassroots mobilization on a continuous basis. Unless, of course, you've got a kind of Bolshevik party that's fused with the most militant sections of the working class and yada yada, all of that stuff. But that's not where we're at. Parties are good in electoral terms. They can be good at mobilizing fairly big amounts of money and leveraging large amounts of labor power in order to get things done, get people elected. They can be good at doing sort of unionization work. They can be good at federating very, very different groups and constituencies of people who want very different things, and giving them a sort of imparting on them a general political line, which can be quite efficacious. But there are things that you sometimes need to do, like Black Lives Matter. That can't be done by a party, right? It can have the involvement of parties, but it can't be done by a party. You can't have a riot that is organized by a party. That's just not the way it works. So these are the things we have to think about. What would you say to the American leftists who feel that party politics are useless and that we should focus exclusively on direct action and organizing? Well, those leftists should focus exclusively on direct action and organizing. It's very simple. We are going to have to learn how to, as I say, we need an ecological conception of organizing. And we're going to have to engage experimentally, because actually we're in a situation where we don't have all the answers. It used to be you could speak about the revolution as an objective process, something that's happening in the real world, and then you kind of infer a series of answers from that. But we're not in that sort of situation. We don't know what's coming. There's a lot of, we didn't expect Bernie Sanders to do so well in 2016. We didn't expect Jeremy Corbyn to do so well in 2017. So we have to experiment. Okay. Best use by energy, etc. Interesting that the right Dems keep tripping down on Israel and are starting to lose here. How do we articulate or dog whistle internationalism in a country that, loves empire? I'm not sure how to answer that question. I don't think it can be dog whistled, I can say that much. I think that internationalism used to be a much bigger feature in politics in the era of the anti-capitalist movement, for example, or the anti-war movement. There was much more of an internationalist consciousness, and I don't know if there's anything we can learn from that. Okay, big question here. Do you think the UK left has spent too much effort fighting within Labour/momentum/electoral work because of the possibility of a Corbyn win seemed possible? Are we not seeing more about labour strikes, tenant union organising because it's not happening enough, or because I'm reading the wrong UK press? Do you identify a lack of base building or working class institutions? Basically, throughout the Corbyn era, the trade union trade union density, in other words, the percentage of the workforce that's represented in trade union, continued to remain fairly stagnant. It didn't plummet, but it was fairly stagnant. Strike levels continued to fall. Basically, what the trade union bureaucracy did was that they voted Corbyn as an attempt to solve their problem, which was declining relevance, lack of political power. So if they could get their man in power, somebody who represented union policies, they could regain their clout within the Labour Party, and then they would not have to be engaging in these risky strategies of building strikes and trying to recruit people who are in precarious workplaces and so on. But ultimately, we are going to need to be building toward that kind of rupture from below at some point. There were some tentative moves towards community organising under Corbyn, but the truth is that that is not something that can be done by Corbyn or McDonnell or anybody else. And the passivity of the base of Corbyn members, of Labour members, interesting slip and not irrelevant, tells you a lot about, how they saw politics. They saw their job as being to keep Jeremy Corbyn in the leadership. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that meant that we neglected the kinds of struggles that could have kept up pressure on the political class, pressure on the ruling class, and strengthened Corbyn's hand. Okay, I've got to the end of this. Do you want me to answer any more of these questions?
Yeah. So we are having a freeze on more questions. So who was the last question you answered? I'm sorry, you've been just going so quickly through them and with such great detail.
Right. So Chris George's question is the last one that I answered. I can see that there's a question from Mike McCarthy and there's one from Lurie.
Yeah, if you could just finish those two, then we'll be great. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so how do you reach people that are no longer involved in the political process? Sanders tried and it did not work. God, I know. We had this problem. I know. Look, I'll tell you this, the sad truth is that the Conservatives were better at doing this than we were. UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which then became the Brexit Party, were better at doing this than we were. And I think that a large part of it, I mean, we did manage to mobilize some former non-voters, but the truth is that the right has been far better at this than us. And I think that's partly because of their recognition of where the main line of antagonism was. It was political. It was about people's lack of faith in political processes, the crisis of democracy, and they're basically on the right. People wanted to believe that there was somebody out there, some leadership who would fight for them. And I think that ultimately there's no such shortcut for us in a way. They can organize on the basis of branding and on the basis of sort of like stock market-like punts, manipulating sentiment, manipulating polling, because all they needed to do is to catalyze existing trends. We need to build a fabric of organizing from below. And that means we need to be organizing where people have needs, practical needs that we can help them reach and satisfy. And on that basis, we can carry out conversations with them that will win them over. But also, there will be moments of radicalization. There will be moments when, for example, the anti-war movement, I remember, drew millions of people into politics who usually are pretty passive. There will be moments when we will have the chance to intervene. And when we do that, we try and keep as many people involved as possible. Okay, God. Doesn't the concept of party go beyond just an electoral party? A new left formation could be created out of something like BLM that joins socialist groups. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I got no problem with that. I think that's absolutely right. Electoralism was a big weakness for us in a way. The focus on getting people out to knock doors and so on meant that we weren't doing the things that a party could do, which was, for example, we could be campaigning in local communities to, say, defend their housing, to knock down their rents, to make sure that people on welfare and so on were getting everything that they were entitled to. All of that sort of stuff we could have been doing and we weren't doing. And I fear that reflects to a large extent, the fact that people rather prefer to do a lot of stuff, displacement activity online, cancelling J.K. Rowling or whoever the schmuck of the week is, rather than actually going out and convincing people who aren't already on the left and don't already speak the left's idiom and aren't actually very clear on issues of gender, race, and so on. So I think we tried to shortcut a whole lot of things, and we're now going to have to learn to be a lot more patient. I will have to stop now, but thank you so much for having me.
It was our pleasure, Richard, and thank you so much for joining in on this call from, 5-6 hours ahead? I see it's very dark where you are now. Yeah, a lot of great questions from everyone. Thank you, and don't be surprised if we bug you again to come into our meetings and just share your words of wisdom.
All right, wicked. I'd love to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.